I would like to welcome our next speaker, Julia Leone, to the stage or to the Zoom. And they will be giving a talk today, Habitat Assessment for Bumblebees in Minnesota Restored and Remnant Prairie.
Hi, thank you. Yeah, thanks for tuning into my talk. I'm joining today from Friends of the Mississippi River. It's a nonprofit based in St. Paul in Minnesota. And I'll be presenting some new research we've begun assessing habitat for bumblebees in restored and remnant prairie. And similar to the previous talk, I'll just say here, and I'll say it again, that the results that I do have today are preliminary. We're still collecting data next year as well. So just keep that in mind as I move forward. And there we go. So as you all know, many of our native pollinator species, including bumblebees like the US federally endangered rusty patch bumblebee, are experiencing population declines. And while we know that there are many factors impacting population declines, including disease and pesticides and other things that have been talked about throughout this conference, we do know that habitat loss and fragmentation continue to be major causes of decline in bumblebee abundance and diversity. In Minnesota, we have lost millions of acres of habitat in the approximately 200 years since European colonization began. And less than 1% of that 18 million acres of prairie remains in Minnesota today. So along with this habitat loss, we have also experienced significant loss of habitat connectivity. The trend is true across much of North America, as well as in grasslands around the world. We've lost about 2/3 or probably more of temperate grasslands worldwide that have been converted to other land uses. We know that organizations spend millions of dollars on land protection and habitat restoration each year, with a common goal of providing habitat for pollinators. As an example, in Minnesota, one of our main sources of grant funding for habitat restoration and protection, our Outdoor Heritage Fund, has spent over $1.5 billion in the last 15 years on habitat protection and restoration. And of course, while it's good and important that we are investing in habitat restoration, we still have questions, right? We do not know enough about what specific prairie restoration techniques or plant diversity levels are needed to provide suitable habitat and encourage the greatest diversity of bumblebees. Of course, there have been many previous studies that have examined differences in bee community composition between remnant and restored prairie, but we still have a need for more studies that incorporate restoration establishment metrics and evaluate the use of habitat assessment tools currently in use by land managers. So this study compares sites seeded with different techniques and seed mix diversity levels, and also compares remnant versus restored prairies in terms of their potential to provide bumblebee habitat, with a goal of providing actionable guidance for restoration practitioners working to restore habitat for bumblebees. And as part of this study, we evaluate the Xerces Society Habitat Assessment Tool predictions and compare those to our on-the-ground surveys. To address our first question, we conducted surveys in 6 30-acre units at the city-owned William H. Holton Conservation Area in Elk River, Minnesota, which was restored with an experimental seed mix design in 2016. Units were either broadcast or drill seeded with one of 3 seeding diversity mixes with 30, 50, or 70 species. To address our second question, we conducted surveys in 12 corporate and state-owned units of restored or remnant prairies, 6 of each type. 2024, so this past summer, was our first of 2 planned field seasons. We conducted 4 standardized 30-minute non-lethal meandering surveys at each unit between May and September to record both the abundance and species richness of bumblebees visiting flowers. On those same days, we also recorded flower diversity and abundance in 30 1 by 1 meter plots along 3 50-meter transects within each of those sampling units using a standardized protocol that was developed by members of the University of Minnesota Bee Lab. We also assessed full vegetation using the Prairie Reconstruction Initiative meandering walk protocol once at each unit during the growing season. And we plan to repeat all of these bumblebee and vegetation surveys in 2025. We're using the Xerces Society Habitat Assessment Tool, as I mentioned, to document how realized diversity and abundance at our sites compare to their assessment scores. So these assessments contain a range of things. They contain regional and land cover analyses in ArcGIS. They include a measure of the diversity of flowering resources across spring, summer, and fall, estimates of bare ground, litter cover, site disturbance such as burning, grazing, haying, and the presence of managed honeybees, among other things. And so that is something I'll talk a little bit more about where we're at with the habitat assessments. But given that we have just completed our first field season, again, the results I'm presenting now are preliminary and subject to change based on additional data collection and analyses to come. So some summary statistics. In the 6 units we surveyed to address our questions about seeding method and diversity levels, we observed over 400 bumblebees of 10 different species. And in the 12 units we surveyed to address our question of restored and remnant prairies, we observed just under 400 bumblebees of 12 different species, including the rusty patch bumblebee. Our preliminary results from this year suggest that bumblebee abundance is higher in units seeded with a higher diversity of species. So this graph shows units seeded with 30 species in blue, 50 species in orange, and 70 species in green. And we found no significant difference in bumblebee species richness between these different mixes. We also found the bumblebee abundance was higher in drill seeded units compared to units where seed was broadcast. Here, observations of bumblebees in drill seeded units are shown in the pale blue compared to the dark blue of broadcast seeded units. Again, no difference in species richness. For our restorations versus remnants, we did find nearly 3 times as many bumblebees in restored units compared to remnant prairie units. And species richness was also higher in our restored units. So that was actually a bit of a surprise to me. So I'm interested to see if that pattern holds true for next year and explore that a little bit more. A few flower summary statistics. Bee balm and field thistle were the flowers we observed the most bumblebees visiting. Canada and grassleaf goldenrods were also frequently visited later in the season, and that accounted for about 2/3 of our observations in both of those sets of units. However, despite the dominant foraging preferences, we did observe bumblebees foraging on a higher diversity of flowers in units seeded with a higher diversity seed mix. So again, that 70 species mix is the highest diversity seed mix, are shown in green here. We also observed bumblebees foraging on a higher diversity of flowers in drill versus broadcast seeded units in the light blue. Bumblebees also visited a higher diversity of flowers at restored versus remnant prairies. Again, this was interesting to see, and I think there'll be a little nuance here once I get into data on seasonal differences, because we did see some differences in whether remnant or restored units had a higher diversity in spring, summer, or fall, and so I think that will that'll be interesting to elaborate on moving forward. So again, of course, these are preliminary results. We're excited to collect another year of data and complete flower and vegetation analyses, as well as habitat assessments. And this is just an example of part of the habitat assessment, which will look at regional land cover of natural lands in a 5-kilometer buffer for each of our sites. We're completing these analyses currently, but do not have results for that yet. for now, a few take-home messages. Overall, it's good news that restorations appear to be providing good foraging habitat for bumblebees, at the very least. So this is an important floral resources are being provided, and we're finding a good diversity and abundance of bumblebees at restorations. Of course, this does not diminish the importance of conserving our remnant prairie, and this remains, a high priority as well. And we're hoping this research will also provide some insight into how these remnants may be better maintained if we see how they differ and what differences are providing the best resources for bumblebees. Our findings do suggest that drill seeding provides a result that is at least as good or better than broadcast seeding for bumblebees. And this is really interesting and I would say good news for the restoration practitioners because drill seeding typically costs less than broadcast seeding, sometimes as much as 3 times less. And so, being able to use drill seeding as an alternative could free up some budget to invest in a higher diversity seed mix for a net benefit for bumblebees. Again, our goals are to provide land managers with information about seeding techniques, seed mix composition, and seed mix diversity levels that can lead to the best results for bumblebees and hopefully pave a way for additional research at a broader scale. Our results will also inform prioritization for protection and conservation. With that, I'll thank our funding source, the Environmental and Natural Resource Trust Fund in Minnesota, and also the DNR, 3M, Flint Hills, and the City of Elk River for permission to conduct research on their land. Thank you also to colleagues and interns at Friends of the Mississippi River who assisted with data collection, as well as other professional colleagues who consulted on the study design and methodology. And finally, I would like to acknowledge that this research takes place on Dakota homelands. And to learn more about our Indigenous partners and the work they do with Friends of the Mississippi River, please feel free to visit the website linked here. And with that, I'd be happy to take any questions. Thank you.